Bonjour! Can you imagine how different life was over 300 years ago here in the Great Lakes region? Much different than the way that we're living today. Those earliest explorers were coming over, trying to find something they called the Northwest Passage, which they felt was a direct route to China. Unfortunately, that passage didn't exist, but instead they found a land that was rich in wilderness and of course the animals living there. Those animals, their fur pelts were so important to the fur trading industry that was about to boom during the colonial period. Those earliest people traveling this great distance, living in this unknown land, began that fur trade. It was a partnership between the Native Americans, the French fur traders, the voyageurs that traveled with their large 40-foot birch bark canoes, and of course the rich merchants that would often trade and barter with those people involved in the trading industry. Of course, the same thing would happen year after year during the fur trade industry. During the winter months, the Native Americans, the men, would go out and spend hours and hours hunting and trapping the different animal furs. Of course, they were trapping things like the beaver pelt, the beaver, rabbit, the red fox, deer, rabbits, and other animals. And then they would gather those animals, their pelts, give them to the Native American women of their village. They would spend several hours then cleaning, stretching, and preparing those pelts for the fur trade. Everybody had a role that they had to do to help with the trading business. Well, during that time period, the beaver pelt was the most important pelt during the trading season. This beaver pelt was used more than any of the furs because down below near the pelt is a very soft felt. During the 1700s, it was very important for the people in Europe to have fashionable clothing, and the beaver pelt was actually used for things like the tri-cornered hat and other fur collars and clothing. So this was the most sought after pelt out of all the animals. So of course, this would have brought in the most for their trade. Now of course the other animals were definitely used in the clothing that they manufactured over in Europe. However, like I said, the beaver pelt was the most important. Well, with the cycle of the fur trading going on, the Native Americans did their job. The French fur traders would often live right in their villages with them. Throughout those winter months, they would be there, forming bonds, making friendships. And the French and the Native Americans got along very well with one another. They relied on each other for the fur trading system. So of course when they were in the villages, they brought with them goods that were manufactured over in Europe, things that couldn't be made in the wilderness, things that would make life much easier for the Native Americans and other people living in the surrounding area. They brought with them goods like cookware, pots, kettles, pans, metal that could be made into knives or S-hooks, things that could help them with their everyday life, hatchets. Of course, woven cloth was very, very important. Anything that wasn't found in the wilderness that would make their lives much better. So of course, the fur traders would barter or they would trade with the Native Americans. And of course, they always wanted to make something called a good trade. So they would make sure that the furs were ready, they would prepare everything as needed, and then they would make their trade or their barter. Then in the early spring, those French fur traders would travel a great distance heading further east. Once they reached the shores of places like Fort Michilimackinac, they would then be at that trading post, ready to trade with the French merchants that were living within the fort walls. Those merchants were typically pretty wealthy during that time period, and they were the ones that helped to control the whole fur trade. So they would take the furs that were brought into them by the voyageurs or by the French fur traders and trade additional goods that they had received from Europe. Everybody relied on one another and the system seemed to work very well. Now there's those voyageurs that would travel in those huge birch bark canoes. They would take the goods from port to port or trading post to trading post, meaning those forts that were built along the lakeside of Lake Huron. Now Fort Michilimackinac, located right at the tip of the Lower Peninsula, that became the center of the trading post. That was the most important area for the whole fur trading system because it was located right at the straits. So the French were able to have control over the whole fur trading system. It was a really busy place. During the different seasons, things always changed in the areas. So in the summer months, the population at Fort Michilimackinac would swell. It would grow a great number. That's because the local Native Americans, the French fur traders, the merchants, the voyageurs would all come to ports like Michilimackinac in order to greet and to continue their bartering and their trading with one another. It was a fantastic time period where people were getting together and forming bonds and making relationships that would help their fur industry grow.